Hi, my name is Reverend Jennifer Allen, and today we're going to be talking about post pandemic grief. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion about it. My hope is that you will engage in this either on Facebook Live, which I hope many people are joining us. But if you didn't catch us on Facebook Live, I want you to tell me where you're viewing us from. I'm doing this broadcast from Atlanta, Georgia, in a cafe that I'm in. So, my hope is that you will be able to tell us where you're viewing this from and participate in the discussion. So, the first question is, what is grief? I'm going to give you a few minutes to type your response. I'm hoping that those of you guys who are joining us are putting in the comments what grief is to you personally. And then I'm going to share what grief is for me personally. Okay, time is up. If you haven't gotten your definition of what you believe grief is, I'm going to tell you what it is. Grief is when we lose something. Most people attributed it to losing a loved one to death, but grief is actually losing anything. It could be a loved one, it could be a job, it could be a housing situation, but most often we attribute grief to the pain and the loss of losing a loved one. Well, if you didn't know it, grief has stages. Dr. Kubler-Ross developed 5 stages of grief. Well, we now discovered that there are more than just 5 stages of grief, and we don't necessarily experience them in order. But the 5 stages of grief, the 7 stages of grief are disbelief and shock, denial, guilt and pain, bargaining, anger, depression, then eventually acceptance. Okay? So let's deal with the first stage. Our first stage of grief is learning someone you love is gone. It creates this numbness inside of you and fills the person with doubt. This emotional way that we're dealing with it makes us so overwhelmed that we just cannot even accept the fact that the person is gone. We even believe that they can't be gone. We literally deny the fact that they're gone. This is kind of like waking up in the morning and going to call the person because you're used to speaking to them every day, but they're not there. Coming home expecting to see to the person, but they're not there. That is the disbelief and shock stage. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily happen in the same order, okay? And so denial is our way of avoiding the pain of the reality of the loss. So the person may even deny the passing of the loved one for weeks. It could be days. But no matter what caused the person to die, we just do not believe that it actually happened, okay? Then there's also the part where we experience guilt and pain. We feel like somehow that it might be our fault. The guilt often is accompanied with pain. The person may feel even kind of like a survivor's guilt, like why them and not me? Why did that person have to die? And then another stage of grief is bargaining. Bargaining is when we begin to negotiate with ourselves, kind of like emotionally releasing it by our mind kind of just drifting from one subject to another, actually thinking, well, maybe this, if we had done this, the person wouldn't have died. Maybe if I had been there more, the person wouldn't have died. So we go through these weird stages where we actually bargain within ourselves, thinking of what we should have, could have done to prevent the situation. The other stage that we go through is anger. And this anger just comes out of nowhere. You are just angry that the person is gone. sometimes even when we're angry, we place blame on someone else or something, or the doctor or the nurses or someone, because we're so overwhelmed that the person is gone that it comes out in a rage. The other stage that can happen is that we can actually feel depression, and that's that deep sadness that we feel that we just can't shake. But one thing I will tell you, when you're going through the stages of grief, recognize that no matter what stage of grief you're experiencing, numbing your emotions actually makes things worse. It's kind of like a beach ball. And if you take a big beach ball and you push it underwater, what's going to happen to that beach ball? You can respond to this question in the comments. Well, if you've ever taken a beach ball as a kid and kind of jumped on it and pushed it down underwater, usually that beach ball is going to pop up. So it's kind of like our emotions. If we keep pushing them down and pushing them down, they're going to keep popping up. And the more you push them down, they're going to keep popping up. The one thing that's different with emotions is when you push them down, they pop up with a greater force than when you push them down. You can slowly push a beach ball down, but when it pops up, it usually pops up with a lot more force than when you pushed it down. And it usually pops up and it, boom, hits us in the head. Well, that's kind of like how our emotions are when we're going through these emotional roller coaster of these stages of grief. Sometimes we feel depressed. Sometimes we feel angry. Sometimes we feel the guilt and pain and wonder what could we have done to prevent this, right? Feel guilty that it wasn't us. Then sometimes you're like, oh, well, I should have done this. I should have done that. Well, no matter what you're experiencing, whether it's denial, shock, or guilt or pain or anger or depression, allow yourself to feel and accept where you are. Take a deep breath, 10 deep breaths, and just accept where you are in your stages and understand it's not going to last forever. So as time goes by, when their birthdays come up, those loved ones that we have lost, you're going to experience these stages again. You may just have a little sadness. You may have anger. You may have pain. You may have bargaining. What we could have, should have done to prevent this, if they had have done this. Sometimes you might even blame the person for their death. But no matter what you have experienced in the loss of that loved one, you're going to experience some of these stages. Now, most times these stages usually last just a couple months. But if it lasts more than 3 or 4 months, where you're in constant anguish, you probably need to speak to a counselor to help you to work through those stages, because you don't want to get stuck in one of them, like anger or depression. If you get stuck, just go see a therapist. They'll help you to work through your emotions. A part of what most therapists do, and I just happen to be a mental health therapist, is we help people accept and manage the emotions rather than numb and ignore them, because ignoring them just makes them pop up and come out more intense. So, pandemic, hundreds of thousands of people lost. It came on so suddenly that none of us had time to prepare. We didn't know how to prevent it other than just stay away or put on a mask. But even masks sometimes didn't keep some people from getting it. And many of us were isolated, and many of us missed the last moments of our loved ones' lives, which is one of the things that makes it so difficult. So post-pandemic deep grief is unique. For instance, when my grandmother, I was younger, and my grandmother passed away, I was able to be there with her. She was able to come home. We were able to give her medicine. We would be able to talk to her. We were able to pray with her. We were able to be there in those last moments of her life. We were able to say goodbye. But with the pandemic, we were isolated from our loved ones. We were lucky if the loved one that we lost passed away at the end of the pandemic, because then they had, ways of using devices like cell phones to allow you to video conference in through tablets or something like that. But at the beginning of the pandemic, it was so shocking and overwhelming to hospitals. All they knew is that they couldn't allow people to come in because they could be bringing in different germs, and they could be bringing in COVID. So many times people weren't even able to see their loved one when they were passing away. Some people passed away in nursing homes. And so we weren't able to go and visit them except for through an outside window. You could look in on them. I've known several people who have lost loved ones, and it was very difficult for them because they couldn't be there with them. They couldn't hold their hand. They couldn't touch them. Those are the most difficult things that people have faced through during this pandemic.